Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. This
How's
flight
the
situation is really
airport?
weird. Oh, it's
Ooh,
wonderful. What I
I'm
think I'm
so
gonna do
glad.
is what I'm so glad what? Oh, so glad the airport is
I'm
good.
just so
Good.
glad that it's been a wonderful airport experience.
Oh, it's been great. Listen, I got an apple that's wrapped in plastic and I got a little
Okay.
water. And I think what I'm gonna do is just say like I think I might put the phone like this and say like my camera is not really working the best. So I will introduce you and yeah, and
Mm,
then I'll be off once like kind of once you get going.
sure.
But I'll be yeah, I'll be around. And if something like if there's like a disaster or something, you can like call me or text me and I'll hop back on.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. It won't be a disaster, honestly. Like it's very
No, I
yeah, and we
don't.
have
I don't
yeah.
anticipate.
Great, great. Did you test the connection to make sure that you can add your um PowerPoint or like you can share screen?
Ye- Yeah, I mean, I did earlier at like three
Great,
or whatever, but
great.
I assume that
Awesome.
works.
Yeah, that works. And then
Cool.
did Jeanette already ask you if it's okay to record you? And if not, that's totally fine. We can delete the recording. I'll just email her and let her know that she should delete it.
Yeah, I mean you can record it, doesn't matter to me.
Great,
So if
great,
you
great. We just
prefer to
want to make
have a
sure.
recording, that is fine by me.
No, that's good. We'll just make sure. Yeah, and then yeah, then we'll get started at 6:30. And
Good.
let's see, yeah, we have 10 minutes. So since everything's working out, we'll just kind of we can get off the video for now and let people kind of populate. And then we'll pop back on at 6:30 and I'll unmute my mic
Okay.
and say hello and I'll introduce you and then we'll get going.
Sounds good.
Amazing. Okay, I'll see you in 10.
All right, sounds good.
Okay.
Bonuses. CFOs don't quit for personal reasons. These are fabulous jobs. You don't get them for the chief executive by being devoted to your family. Nobody gets one of these jobs without giving up a great deal of what most people enjoy about life. Things like family, friends, nights out. Competition for these positions is so fierce that when you finally land one, you don't have to leave, not for no reason. When C-suite executives leave for undisclosed personal reasons, it's almost always because there's something wrong.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. Alyssa Cady. I'm the director of the Center for Interfaith Dialogue. I am so glad to welcome you all here tonight to hear from Dr. Carolyn Tobin. For sort of business, we'd really appreciate if everyone could mute their microphones so that we don't have any distractions during the talk. And then we wanted to let you know that if we have any questions during the lecture, you can wait until the end of the lecture and either raise your hand using the chat feature in the bottom of your screens, or you can post question at the into the chat, and Dr. Tobin will call on you and take your question. If you're interested in other programming from the department, the Center for Interfaith Dialogue here at Temple Emanu-El, we have a variety of programming on offer you can find at our website, interfaith@emanu-el.nyu, or .org. And if you're interested in spending, for example, next Sunday, the first night of Hanukkah with us, we'll be joining Holy Trinity Church on the West Side at 5 p.m. for their wonderful Bach Vespers, where you can hear from Cantor Mo Glasman and Pastor Timothy Wiseman, and enjoy a nice dinner with friends after the services. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Carolyn Tobin is a professor of classics. She received her PhD from Princeton University in 2019 with a dissertation on Roman Republican history and has taught at Vassar College, Vanier College, and McGill University. Tonight's lecture is entitled Religious Tolerance and Persecution in the Roman Empire. Dr. Carolyn Tobin will tell us about people famed for throwing Christians to the lions and destroying the temple in Jerusalem. The Romans were often surprisingly welcome of foreign gods and their city and their prayers. This talk will trace Roman attitudes towards the religious practices of other peoples throughout their history, asking, did the Romans view other religions as legitimate? How multicultural were Roman religious practices? When and why did they forbid certain kinds of worship? These questions of religious tolerance will help us consider the larger relationship between identity, religion, and imperial politics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Tobin to the stage. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for that very generous welcome. And thank you all so much for being here and for inviting me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing with you all. And yes, please do keep questions in mind, and I'll be very happy to chat with you afterwards. So I will share my screen with you here. And yeah, let's begin. So, in the year 249 CE, the Roman emperor demanded that every citizen of the Roman Empire sacrifice to the gods. Rome's empire had been wrecked by civil war, foreign invasion, and economic collapse, and the emperor, who was a man by the name of Decius, concluded that the best way to restore prosperity to the empire was to restore its relationship with higher powers. For the Romans, this meant sacrificing, or slaughtering an animal and burning part of it on an altar so that the smoke would reach the gods and the offering would be accepted. In this time of crisis, Decius claimed every citizen had to band together and support the state by beseeching the gods, and this could be any gods at all, since for the Romans, every god existed. And Decius even insisted that each citizen sacrifice before a Roman official and get a receipt affirming as much, which is what you see here on your screen. And so not coincidentally, this act of sacrifice was also the clearest display of what it meant to be Roman. It was a cultural marker that affirmed the membership in the community of the Roman Empire and brought together disparate populations spread across continents with one shared ritual. Of course, quite famously, not every population used animal sacrifice to communicate with the divine. And so Jews appear to have been exempt from this decree based on the long antiquity of their practices, and possibly also in exchange for prayer on behalf of the emperor and for the safety of the empire. The early Christian population, however, was not exempt. And so failure to sacrifice could result in exile, loss of property, torture, or even death. And so one story of a Christian martyr who died during the enforcement of this decree points to one of the main reasons why the Romans and Christians so famously came into conflict and did it so often, namely a fundamental theological disconnect between the two groups. And so here's our quote from this act of the martyr Paeonius. And so the proconsul, right, who's the Roman official, said, "Sacrifice." And Paeonius replied, "No, for I must pray to God." So the proconsul said, "We worship all gods in heaven and all gods who are in heaven. I suppose you hearken to the air? Sacrifice to it." And so Paeonius replied, "I do not hearken to the air, but to the one that made the air and heaven and everything in them." So the proconsul said, "Tell me who made them." So Paeonius answered, "It is not possible to say." So the proconsul said, "Obviously, it was God, the very Zeus, who is in heaven, for he is king of all the gods." And so to the Romans, as I said, this act of sacrifice was an act of cultural belonging and an act of supporting the empire that, to their mind at least, protected and supported its citizens in turn. It didn't matter which god you sacrificed to, and it was nearly incomprehensible that you wouldn't be willing to communicate with a higher power in this way. If you worship the king of the gods, a creator with ultimate power in the sky, what you call him is irrelevant, right? Zeus, Jupiter, Jesus, God, Amun-Ra, right? All are ultimately the same power in the Roman mindset. As the Roman philosopher Cicero wrote hundreds of years prior to this, quote, "The gods have as many names as mankind has languages." To Paeonius, however, this act of sacrifice would be giving sustenance to a demon. It would be false worship. It would be a betrayal of his beliefs, even if nominally the sacrifice was to a god that he believed in. And so it's this contrast of perspectives that I want to talk about today. And so we'll trace Roman perspectives on foreign gods, considering both the times when they tolerate other religions and even welcome new gods into their state worship, and the times when religious difference is disrespected or even violently punished. I want to focus on a few different cases. Of course, I can't cover all of Roman religious history, but I want to take some samplings to try to understand the range of responses, right, from a culture that seems entirely open to new populations and new religious ideas to an empire that violently punishes some forms of religious dissent. And so hopefully we'll try to think about why that is, why we see that range. But before we do that, I thought we should clarify what we mean when we talk about religion and Roman religion, and in contrast, what the Romans themselves meant when they talked about Roman religion. And so to start with us, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, right, the word religion in English means a couple different things. So it can either refer to a particular system of faith or worship, i.e., right, there are multiple systems, multiple religions in the world, and you have one to which you ascribe. It also can refer to this broader concept, right, of belief, right, in some superhuman power, manifested in worship of that power, and therefore the larger system, right, that you participate in order to achieve either spiritual or material improvement. And so one of our biggest distinctions in the modern world as well, in terms of thinking about studying, categorizing religions, is this distinction between monotheism, right, the worship of just one God, believing that only one God exists, and polytheism, right, the worship of multiple gods, and therefore the belief that multiple gods exist. And so from our perspective then, right, the Romans lived in a pluralistic world that had a number of what we would label as different religions, right? Egyptian religion, Celtic religion, Greek polytheism, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, eventually Christianity, right? Each of those are systems of faith and worship to us, right? The gods have different names. The narratives about the gods are different, right? The practices, the methods of worship, they aren't the same from one to the other. The Romans, however, had a very different understanding of both what religion is and even how many different religions there are. And so to the Romans, right, the term that they have for religion is religio, obviously where we get our modern word, our English word religion from. And so to them, right, this word refers to the relationship of a community to its gods, essentially. So it is a communal relationship, and by extension, right, if you have a communal relationship with some being, there are a system of obligations that comes with it, right? And so yes, it is this communal relationship and the pious obligations that are part of maintaining that relationship. And so, by extension, right, it's the total of current practice of and for a political community. And again, to a Roman perspective, that community, right, is a community not just of the humans who live there, but of the gods as well that any given community worships. And so maintaining that communal relationship, that is religion, that is religio. And so, however, what the Romans do not classify as religio are these things that are very fundamental to the idea of religion to us, right? The Romans don't think of religio as being exclusive. They don't think of there as being multiple different religios out there, right? Every community has its own relationship. Maybe it pursues it slightly differently from others, but they are all, in essence, practicing religio, right? Religion itself, right, is a practice that is not, right, dependent upon how strong your faith is. It is also not, this particular word religio, right, is not about the sentimental relationship between the individual and whatever higher power they are worshiping. That's not to say that no Roman ever felt a religious connection or a sentimental link, but religion, right, is not that to them. Religion is community. And so, right, one of the most significant consequences of this difference from us is that to the Romans, right, as I said, different communities can perform religio differently. Each community has its own relationship with the gods, but that doesn't mean that you belong to one religio to the exclusion of another, right? The way in which a community communicates with its gods will be slightly different, but performing religio your way does not preclude you from trying out some other way in the future, right? There's no single word for Roman religious practice, right? Like Buddhism or Christianity or Islam, right? The Romans thought of there are Romans and there are people from India and there are Arabs, and they each try to appease the god in the right way to ensure their survival. And so fundamentally, right, everyone does religio, right? We just all do it in different ways that have been passed down from our ancestors. And so because this is such a communal concept, right, performing it correctly is, as we saw with the earlier example of the Decree of Decius, right, this is a matter of community membership. And so just because there aren't multiple religions in our sense, however, it doesn't mean that the Romans can't think that their manner of worshiping is better than everyone else's. And in fact, of course, that is exactly what they thought. And so, as the first century BCE philosopher and theologian Cicero, that I quoted earlier, he claimed, right, that we Romans are far superior in religio, by which mean the cultivation of the gods. And so he further maintained a little bit later in this treatise, right, that our state could not have been as great as it is, excuse me, had we not maintained the fullest measure of divine favor. And so to the Romans, the success of any given community, right, the success of the state is evidence that the gods are on your side, that you have done your religio correctly, right? If you defeat everyone else, it's because you've been the most successful in courting the favor of the gods. And so this quote also emphasizes, right, one of the most important ideas in Roman perspectives towards religion, right? For the Romans, essentially, the older, the better, right? The more ancestral the practice, the more proof that it has worked and that it has succeeded in getting the gods on your side, and so the better it is. And so we see when it comes to ruling other peoples the Romans only very rarely interfere with practices that they view as ancestral, right? They think that every community, in theory, has the right to continue the religious rituals and communications that have been passed down and that have maintained their status with the gods previously, even if the Romans may personally find them confusing or may find them even barbaric. Because, right, if you stop those practices, which the gods are now expecting, right, it will cause disorder, it will cause unhappiness, and no one wants unhappy gods. And so even from the very beginning of Roman worship, right, it was very heavily influenced by the cultures that surrounded Rome. And so Roman myths, the kind of the fundamental stories about themselves, maintained that they were initially a community of outcasts and a community of immigrants, that they were younger than their neighbors. And they made no attempt to hide that their religious practices had borrowed from both the Greeks and other peoples in Italy at the time, especially this group called the Etruscans. And so even though they had their own native versions of many different gods, right, they happily equated them with their Greek counterparts, right? Zeus and Jupiter, fundamentally the same thing, for instance. And sometimes they would even take gods from the Greeks wholesale, right? Like the god of the sun and healing called Apollo, right? They changed very little about it. They didn't really have an equivalent, so they just said, okay, this seems like a good god to worship. We want him on our side. Let's start worshiping him. And so the Romans even incorporated, right, explicitly foreign forms of religious expertise and religious priesthoods into their structures of state religion. And so they believed that those Etruscans, right, those other Italian peoples had special access to divine knowledge, had these special soothsayers, and so they would commission these haruspices, right, to interpret signs of the gods when the Romans were concerned that the gods may be unhappy. They also believed, right, that one of their first kings had acquired a book of prophecies, but from a Greek prophetess, right? So these Sibylline books, right, are written in Greek, acquired from Greece, or at least a Greek woman. And there were special priests, special Roman priests, whose job it was to interpret these prophecies and kind of help steer Roman, essentially religious practices, depending on what the prophecies said, again, if there was some kind of bad omen. And so foreign religious knowledge, once it had been incorporated into the Roman state structure, was fundamental to how they navigated divine relationships. Right? And so this shows that at least at the beginning, Roman practices and Roman religious knowledge were permeable, right? They fully recognized that they owed debts to the practices of other cultures and recognized these things as foreign in origin throughout their history. And so the Romans would even use these books of prophecy, right, these Sibylline books, to import new gods to Rome and fully integrate them into their worship. And so as long as they followed the legal process that had been approved by the Senate, which was the governing body during the Republic, right, even very alien-seeming gods could be welcomed and could be made Roman. And so in 204 BCE, right, which was during one of the major wars of the Roman Republic, just as an example, right, Rome was losing, right? The North African troops of Hannibal were campaigning throughout Italy. Rome feared their own destruction, right? And so naturally, right, as we saw with that Cicero quote, they assumed that their military failures were because the gods were unhappy. And so they consulted the Sibylline books, and the books told them that the answer was to import a new goddess from Phrygia, right, which is in modern-day Turkey, and the goddess's name was Cybele. Right? She was a goddess of protection, of fertility, of prophecy, and so the Romans said, all right, we need a new goddess on our side to win this war. And so they sent envoys to the king of that area, and they asked if they could bring the goddess back to Rome. And so the king showed them the essentially earthly instantiation of this goddess, which was a giant meteorite, very different from Roman ideas of what the gods looked like. But they said, this is our image of the goddess Cybele. They asked the goddess, the meteorite, for its permission, and the Roman Roman perspectives on this story claim that the earth trembled with a long rumbling, and the goddess spoke in her shrine. It was my own wish that I besought. Let there be no delay. Send me, I'm willing. Rome is a worthy place to which every god should go. Obviously, this is a Roman perspective on where the religious center of the world should be. But regardless, the Romans said, okay, the goddess says, okay, everything is good. So they put the meteorite on a boat. They sail back to Italy, and members of the state priesthoods, all of the matrons of the wealthiest families, line up to welcome it. We hear that the population rushes outside of the gates to welcome this new goddess, even though she is entirely foreign in her name and her appearance. Right? The Romans had never worshipped a rock before. And as they would find out, the rites to keep her happy were also very different from what they were used to. But in the moment, right, the inclusion of this very foreign goddess into Roman worship was considered not just an appropriate thing to do, but it was an exciting thing to do. It was beneficial. It was necessary. And so once the goddess arrives, however, right, the Romans do have to come to terms with not just the welcoming of this foreign goddess into their pantheon, which theologically posed no problems to them whatsoever, but they did also have to welcome, right, the rites and practices that were associated with her, which were foreign and which were much harder for them to accept. And so that brings us to another bigger difference of Roman religion from many of the religions that we think about today. And so Roman religion has often been described as being not particularly concerned with orthodoxy, right, i.e., believing the right thing about the gods, but being more interested in orthopraxy, right, doing the right thing vis-a-vis the gods. And so it's an exaggeration to say that it didn't matter at all what you believed. But what counted in terms of what like the Roman state would regulate was performing the correct actions for the gods, which were very prescribed and specific. Any given prayer you would read off of a book, right? It wouldn't come from the heart. And so when you hear Romans talking about superstitions or about negative foreign religious behavior, right, it's the way in which they communicate with their gods that's the problem, not what they believe about those gods or the existence of those gods at all. And so when the priests of this foreign goddess Cybele arrive, right, the Romans discover that in order for the goddess to be content and happy, she requires ritually castrated priests. She requires people entering ecstatic states to recite her prophecies, right? Loud processions, cymbals, banging, begging alms from the populace, right? None of these things were in the Roman ritual handbook. And so the Romans had won the war, and so therefore, by their communal contract, right, they owed Cybele eternal worship in Rome, but, right, they couldn't countenance or kind of wrap their heads around the type of ritual that she demanded in order to be happy. And so the Romans had to figure out a compromise. And so what they did, right, was they said, all right, we will have Roman priests who worship her as the Romans do, right? We will have a Roman style temple. We will have regular sacrifices to her. We will have Roman style festivals for her. We will give her the name Magna Mater, right, the Great Mother. So we'll give her a Latin name. However, right, Cybele still expects, right, the kind of ritual activity and communication that she had had before. They can't make her unhappy. And so what they do is they import priests from Phrygia, right, from modern day Turkey. And so those imported priests would perform the foreign rites, right? They would do the castration, the ecstasy, the foreign instruments, the foreign dress. And so they even forbid, right, Roman citizens were not allowed to participate in those foreign style rights. And so I think this example is helpful to us, right, because it shows essentially the limits of what their religious practice could handle, right? The Romans were willing to entertain all gods in their city. They were willing to entertain even practitioners of foreign gods. That wasn't a problem, right? But right, the Romans themselves couldn't perform the ritual actions that conflicted with their own kind of communal self-image. And so if the goddess needs worship, they need someone to do that. They just realize it can't be them. And so, and they even, right, they have this other version, anthropomorphic version of Cybele seen here on this coin in a chariot drawn by lions. And so we see over time that it's these foreign practices, which the Romans will sometimes label as superstitions, right, that cause both theoretical and practical problems for them. And so on the theological side, right, the Romans believed that incorrect practices, right, these superstitions, wronged the gods, right? And so therefore incorrect practices in the Roman community, right, would threaten that relationship between divine and human that was central to religio and central to their success. And so therefore, right, it was their duty to limit these superstitions, right, in situations where those incorrect practices could endanger Rome's relationship with the gods. And so then on the more practical side, right, as we can see in this second quote, right, the introduction of foreign religions isn't just a religious problem, in that it can also pose political problems, because the Romans believed, right, that those who attempt to distort our religion with strange rites, that these people, the persuasive figures, right, who are introducing new methods of worship, could then convince their followers to abandon the Roman way of life and abandon Roman religious practices, right? Because to the Romans, right, political affiliation, social affiliation, and religious action, right, those are all one unit. Those are all one communal set of activities. And so unsanctioned additions to those religious actions would destabilize your allegiance to Rome. And so it was this fear, right, that leads the Romans to sometimes ban particular cults or particular practices, which could have violent consequences. And so the first time that recorded, at least, that we do get these violent consequences of religious action is in 186 BCE. And so this is less than 30 years, right, after Cybele / Magna Mater had been very enthusiastically brought to Rome. And so, although the Romans developed very extravagant stories about this so-called Bacchanalian conspiracy, basically what it boils down to is that the cult of the Greek god Bacchus, right, otherwise known as Dionysus, basically two names for the same guy, this was spreading in popularity throughout Italy. And it was not just official state, or it wasn't at all official state importations of this cult, like with Magna Mater, but it was a ground up movement. And so this worship was particularly popular among women, and it involved, like the worship of the Magna Mater, right, kind of driving yourself into an altered, ecstatic state where you become someone else, right? Madness, doing things you have no control over. For Bacchus, right, through the use of wine. And so groups would meet at night, they would drink, they would revel, right? They had kind of secrets that would be revealed, right? And so their behavior was in some ways secret from outsiders. And so eventually, right, the Roman Senate became alarmed that this very Greek cult, though they had welcomed and worshipped, right, countless other Greek cults into their midst, but the Senate was concerned about this one. And so they published a series of very punishing regulations, right? And so they demanded any shrine to Bacchus has to be torn down. Men and women are forbidden to worship Bacchus together, right? No rites to Bacchus can be performed in secret. No vows can be made between worshippers of Bacchus unless they get approval from the state. And so people not complying with these orders, according to the historians in Rome, were tried, were detained, and if they pursued criminal activities while they were in this altered state, could also be killed. And so scholars have kind of puzzled over, right, why the response towards this Bacchic worship is so severe. But it does fit into the ideas that we've already seen, right? That worship that was determined to be un-Roman in its ritual, right, that lures people into secret practices, right, that the Roman state is unable to control, right, that are not transparent, and that could produce, right, threatening allegiances kind of outside of the community, right, hence the concern about them swearing vows to one another. And so simple private worship of Bacchus would not have been a problem. However, private worship of Bacchus that could threaten the cohesion of Roman ritual practice was a problem. And so the Romans were concerned, right, about the potential anger of this god if they forbid his worship. But as the Roman historian Livy claims, right, the collective opinions of the various different Roman religious authorities determined essentially that if someone is using the authority of the gods as a way to commit a crime, right, if people are saying, oh, human misdeeds are okay as long as there is divine law allowing it, the Romans say that, that is not true, right? Essentially, they are saying we have decided that you do not need to be concerned, because essentially action in self-defense of kind of the Roman community, even if it might anger a god, right, seems to have been considered religiously acceptable. And so, yes, religion cannot excuse criminal behavior, according to the Romans. And so far, we've seen Roman responses to religious practices that conflict with Rome in terms of their ritual, but not in terms of theology, right? Things that fit into this broad polytheistic mindset. However, Rome does encounter monotheistic religions, as we saw at the beginning of this talk, right? Both Judaism and its later offshoot, Christianity. And so for the last part of this talk, right, I wanted to look at Roman reactions to Judaism as a final example. And so by the time the Romans had encountered Judaism, right, it was a religion divided in some ways, and that there was a population living under Greek rule around Jerusalem, right, worshiping in the Second Temple, but there was also a diasporic population that had spread across the Mediterranean. And so the movement of this population outside of Judea, right, brought Jews to Rome, as well as to other territories that were being governed by the Romans. Eventually, around 6 CE, right, after decades of Roman military and political involvement in that area, the Romans finally annexed that area, which they called Judea, including Jerusalem. And so, very broadly speaking, right, the Romans cared much more about the religious activity in their city, right, that influenced their communion with the gods than the practices of their subjects in the provinces. They did, of course, encounter Judaism and find its theological differences both kind of puzzling and essentially incompatible with their worldview. But as we can see in this quote, right, the Roman writer Varro in the 1st century BCE just assumed that they could kind of equate the supreme god of Judaism with Jupiter and call it a day, right? It makes no difference by what name he is invoked. It's the same guy. And so as their exposure to Judaism continued, however, right, they were realizing that they were dealing with something quite different. And so our first interaction between the Romans and Jews in Rome itself that we have recorded is a hostile one. And so in 138 BCE, right, the Jews, as well as these Babylonian practitioners, these astrologers, were expelled from Rome for, quote, trying to pass their sacred rites on to the Romans. And in addition, right, we hear that the Senate removed their private altars from public places. And so these accusations against the Jews and this expulsion may be related to the Roman kind of distrust of the strong cultural differences between Jewish and Roman practices, right, that were very clear to them, right? They had different diet, they maintained the Sabbath, right? The Jewish population was not going to participate in Roman communal, right, religious activity. However, right, these accusations also fit into Rome's kind of broader skepticism towards religious experts or specialists that are outside of their control, right? People who have non-Roman religious knowledge. And they're also very afraid, right, as we saw with the Bacchanalia, of, right, non-Senate controlled ritual, kind of entering into public spaces, and therefore having the potential of encouraging Romans to convert to another way of thinking, and therefore, again, endangering this communal relationship with the gods. And so the Romans will periodically expel the Jews from Rome, right, in 19, in 39, citing similar reasons, right? Either because they claim that they were causing public disturbances, or because they claim they were kind of freelance Jewish experts trying to spread their rights to the Romans. And so alongside these waves of intolerance, which seem to be very briefly maintained, and that we will hear about a Jewish population in Rome the following year in all of these cases, but right, apart from these moments, which are maybe as performative as anything else, right, the Roman government in the early first century was astonishingly lenient towards the growing Jewish population, both at Rome and in the provinces. And so this is partially because of the political alliances between Caesar and Augustus and the powers ruling in Jerusalem, but right. Several of Rome's most powerful leaders essentially grant dispensation to Jews to assemble for worship, to collect money to support sacrifices at the temple. They give them allowances to not do Roman military service, right, because they wouldn't be able to keep kosher while doing so. They even, right, give Jews in Rome the right to collect free grain that came from the government on a different day. If it fell on the Sabbath, they would keep some aside and give it to them on a later day. And so the Emperor Augustus, right, cites the friendship between these two communities as the reason, right? Partially it's a political move. But his phrasing also suggests that the ancient nature of Jewish practices is also part of it, right? This ancestral law, right, has to be respected if possible, even if it's foreign to the Roman ways of thinking. It also helped, right, that the high priest at the temple consented to sacrifice not to the Roman emperor, of course, but to his god on behalf of the emperor and on behalf of the Roman state. And so the Romans essentially decided this is a fair compromise, right? We recognize that you have this monotheistic thing that we don't understand, but you are essentially giving us religious confirmation of our rule, and you are supporting, right, our relationships to any kind of higher power, even your own. And so, sadly, right, all of this relationship building does fall apart, right, when the Jews, in search of self-governance, attempt to free themselves from Roman rule. And so, for the Roman perspective, right, this moves these Jewish practices firmly into the realm of a dangerous superstition, right? It is harmful to Rome's political and religious well-being. Therefore, it's gone in a criminal direction, and from the Roman perspective. And so when Judea rises up against the Romans respond brutally, right? They burn the Second Temple, they put a ban on proselytizing, they institute a particular tax diverting Jewish money towards the worship of Jupiter, and eventually, right after a second revolt, they expel the Jews from the province altogether. And so, although the tensions, right, leading to the Jewish revolts have a lot to do with the disrespect of the Roman administrators towards these ancestral rights that Augustus seemed to think were so important, but these brutal acts of violence themselves, right, were to a Roman mind not a matter of religion, right? They weren't a matter of tolerance or persecution, right? They were political acts, right, that were intended to protect Rome's personal and religious prosperity at all costs. And so they seemed to believe that respect and tolerance were due only to the religious practices that either affirmed Rome's connection to higher powers or at least didn't interfere with it. And so centuries later, once Christianity had overtaken the Roman Empire, right, Christian emperors began turning those similar tactics on the pagans, right, who were still clinging to traditional Roman practices. And so in 382 CE, right, the Christian emperor of the time decided to remove all the pagan religious trappings, right, namely the altar that they would swear oaths on from the Senate House of Rome, right? He's going to take out everything related to pagan worship. And so by this time, right, the rise of Christianity and numerous other factors had basically transformed the idea of religio, right? The religious landscape of Rome was now one of religions, plural, right? If you choose to be a Christian, you are not a pagan, and vice versa. And so one of the last remaining pagan senators made a passionate plea for religious tolerance in the other direction, right? Pleading for the Christians to tolerate pagan worship. And so what he said, right, was, we ask then for peace for the gods of our fathers and of our country. It is just that all worship should be considered as one. We look on the same stars, the sky is common, the same world surrounds us. What difference does it make by what pains each seeks the truth? We cannot attain to so great a secret by one road. And so Symmachus was essentially asking to go back to a world, an ideal world, right, where plurality and difference were possible. By this time, however, it was too late. And paganism, not Christianity, was the religious practice, the superstition that was endangering Rome's relationship with the divine. All right, thank you so much. And please, if you have any questions, I am very happy to take them. All right, any questions? You can either raise your hand, you can type in the chat.
Carolyn, thanks for an amazing presentation. You make what for us is a seemingly very complex series of topics so consumable. So thank you for your knowledge and your presentation style.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yes, why was Christianity a threat to Rome early on? So a number of different, yeah, that relationship is obviously very complicated. And so initially part of it, so at the very beginning, right, Christianity is purely viewed as a kind of subsection of Judaism, right? For the first century, really, right? Romans are thinking of Christians as essentially Jews, but Jews that have changed their beliefs and are not, right, following those ancestral beliefs that are passed down. So part of it is there's some illegitimacy that they're thinking of there, but a lot of it is, again, this concern over, right, these are people who are unwilling to be like us, right? These are people who are unwilling to sacrifice. They are unwilling to kind of support the Roman state and support our relationship with the gods. And so that's usually where they run into trouble, either because they are, right, because the Romans view them as causing public disturbances, right? If there's, right, if, say, multiple different Christian sects are arguing against one another and the Roman governor doesn't know what to do about it. Sometimes that will happen. But when we first hear about it, right, it's very, very sporadic. And so it is only in these situations, like with the decree of Decius, right, where the Romans feel that they need essentially or expect the religious support and the expression of belonging that sacrifice gives, that when a Christian refuses to do that, that becomes an issue to the Romans. Yeah. I mean, if there are no questions, no need to linger, but thought would keep the floor open.
I had a question,
Mhm.
Tobin. The like if you look at modern day Western democracies, at least a lot of them, there's kind of a state religion that, and I'm just wondering, can you create a direct link back to this kind of the idea of a state religion today, to the Roman ideas of, kind of state religion, and it's about practices that society does to please the gods? Because it feels like we've inherited a fair amount of that, because there are all kinds of things that people do to kind of please gods in the
Mhm.
current world. But just is there any way to kind of make a link, or is it just too far between?
Yeah, no, I think there's a link. I mean, I think a lot of it is filtered through, obviously depends on where in the world you're talking, but a lot of it is more filtered through kind of the Christian idea of that. But also, I mean, Christianity is developing in that Roman world, right? I mean, they have a different idea of the way that you communicate with the gods, and they think of kind of their community as being separate, initially as being separate from your political allegiance, right? Which is part of what's so kind of revolutionary about it. We can have a community that's not Roman or Greek or Jew or whatever. It's its own thing. Um, but but yes, I think the idea that I think the idea that having a community and needing and having that community need to maintain a relationship with a higher power through ritual action is, yeah, something that is not exclusively Roman. I mean, the Greeks were doing similar things, but is something that, right, filters into Christian ideas and ideas of kingship and statehood kind of coming out of that Roman period. All right. Well, Alyssa, I mean, if we have no further questions, I'm happy to just close it all out and thank you all so much for your attention and time. Yes, all right. So sounds good. Have a lovely night, everyone. And yeah, again, appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much.
Of course. You're very welcome.